Diablo 4's Season 5 starts today. There's some pretty interesting changes in this patch which will affect core systems and change how the game works in pretty fundamental ways. This will change everything from optimal leveling path to damage scaling per class and majorly impact some builds, like buff some and nerf some others. We're going to go over all that today. Let's jump in. So the first major change in this patch is that historically you only really got an XP bonus for killing monsters that were about 10 levels higher than your current character level. If you went anything beyond that, the monsters continued to scale in difficulty, but you didn't get much XP bonus from them. With this patch that changes, and now that maximum XP gap has flipped all the way up from 10 to 30 in World Tier 4. So effectively now, if you can push higher and fight higher level monsters as you level, you can level up even more quickly, which I think is good. This will incentivize people to like play more content. It actually rewards you for being able to tune your build and fight stuff that's significantly more challenging. This will be particularly potent when combined with another change that's coming this patch with profane mind cages. These are those little brain consumable icons that you could use that made it so monsters and Helltides were 10 levels higher. I'm pretty sure it's a 10 level buff. Before you could only use one. It would make the monsters and Helltides 10 levels higher than their typical base level. Now you can do this up to 3 times. So combine that with the new maximum level scaling on these monsters and you can make Helltides a pretty potent way to level. They were already often considered the quickest way to level, and this is going to make them even more effective. Something to note here, though, is that due to this change, nightmare dungeons are also going to be more effective. Because you can control what level you're fighting monsters at in nightmare dungeons. So when you craft sigils, you can push up higher, make it a little more challenging for yourself because you're going to want to do that to level up your glyphs for your Paragon boards anyway. So I think that the typical way of leveling, where we go through Helltides to level quickly and then switch to Nightmare Dungeons to level those up, will probably be the same, but we are now incentivized to like push up into higher levels. We'll see how this actually plays out. But again, hopefully this will incentivize people to push more challenging content, and we can kind of make the leveling process a little more interesting than always just lock it into that 10 level gap. Infernal Hordes are kind of the new mode for this season. They're a wave-based kind of dungeon where you go in and you will go through waves of enemies, and between each wave you can pick some attributes which will change how your character behaves and how the enemies behave and make it kind of easier in some ways and more challenging in others. The system's pretty self-explanatory as you jump in. I'm not going to go into crazy detail here, but something interesting to note here is that the Infernal Compasses, which are the material you need to get into Infernal Hordes, in the PTR, those were pretty hard to come by. They were rare. But now they've made it so these drop a little bit more frequently, and the gear that drops in the Infernal Hordes has been buffed. You get more gear. So we'll see. We'll see if this is kind of an effective way to gear up once we're getting into endgame. I'll be playing and streaming live and kind of sussing this out shortly after launch this afternoon. So hop in and you can kind of see if it winds up being something that's worth our time. We can chat about it, but it is a cool mode. Just it's a kind of a new challenge. It felt okay in the PTR. I wasn't super keen on it, and a lot of people kind of had the same impression that it just wasn't worth our time. But it's been changed quite a bit, so we'll see how it feels at launch here. Moving on to some other more interesting kind of broad sweeping changes here. This is a big one. Weapon types are available to more classes. So as you can see, druids can use polearms, one-handed swords and daggers. Necromancers can use maces and axes, and sorcerers can use one-handed swords and one-handed maces. So this will be kind of interesting because there's some uniques. There's a bunch of uniques this season. And a bunch of new uniques this season, and this will kind of make some of those available. It'll be interesting to see what builds end up using these and how they work. While we're there, inherent affixes have also been changed. Historically, there were a bunch of affixes on weapons which made it so those weapons weren't really used. You'd see certain classes would never use certain weapons that were available to them because those affixes just weren't typically good for that class. These have all been tweaked a little bit from things like, lucky hit chance to vulnerable damage or life on kill to summoning damage to make it so that the weapons across the board have a little bit more utility, and weapons of certain types aren't really just non-starters for classes anymore. I think this is a good change, and it will also kind of break up the meta a little bit on what weapons are best for builds. So just kind of look at the build guides for whatever you're looking at, or just look through the weapons and kind of reevaluate those, because again, these have all changed for the ones that were not being used super often. The next change here is pretty big. This is maybe the kind of most interesting fundamental change, which isn't super tangible, but I think it'll impact how classes feel to play pretty substantially. So the core stat damage buff. Historically, we would always gain 1% for every 10 primary core stat, 1% skill damage for every 10 primary core stat across the board. This has been changed now, where depending on the class, this will scale a little bit differently. So for druids, necromancers, and sorceresses, it is 8 primary core stat down from 10. So you get 1% skill damage increase for every 8 primary core stat for those 3 classes. For rogue, it's down to 9, so it's not quite as good, but the rogues are also buffed. You'll note that the barbarian is not mentioned here at all, so this is kind of like a barbarian nerf in that they are still 10 for 1%. So again, I think this will largely just buff every class. In particular, I think this will be combined with some of the stuff we are seeing for sorceress here. Sorceress got a lot of buffs across the board. I think a lot of kind of tier rankings and skill guides will be having sorceress as a more interesting class this season. Same for rogue. A lot of these changes are going to just make it so rogue has a lot more viable builds, and it'll be interesting to see. I don't think barbarian's in a terrible place, but I think this may be the kind of season of the sorcerer. Hopefully we'll see, because I think sorcerer needs some love. But something we should talk about there is that there have been some changes to flame shield and blood mist. So historically there were builds which would make it so you kind of just chained flame shield and blood mist and stayed in immune state as long as possible. Both of these skills have been changed, so the cooldown will only trigger once the immunity ends. So this is a pretty big nerf for Flame Shield and Blood Mist. Blood Mist you can dodge while in it now for Necromancer, so that'll be interesting to see. I think there'll be some cool, interesting builds with uniques where you can like dodge when outside of Blood Mist and go into Blood Mist and dodge some more and then come out. Yeah, this will impact Flame Shield. Those kind of builds where like you're just trying to keep Flame Shield up as much as possible aren't going to be quite as viable anymore, so we'll see if this hampers it. This may kind of toss the season back to rogues a little bit, but we'll see how it plays. Across the board, there's been tons of changes to uniques. Like there's tons and tons of new uniques. Ancestral uniques are now called Mythic Uniques, I think, and they have like a new color system so you can see them more easily. And yeah, I think we'll see a lot more builds in the build guides which are using those uniques. If you're looking for help on builds or anything, feel free to hop into the Discord. People are always asking questions, and I'm happy to kind of point people in certain directions and make recommendations there. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail here because it would be quite a long video. But yeah, I think that is most of the big stuff this season. A couple other more interesting notes is tutorial quests. This is just a huge quality of life change. Historically, like every time you'd make a new character or start in a new season, you'd have to go through and do all the the crafting quests and like go, here's how tempering works, here's how gem crafting works. Those are now account wide, so that'll be kind of nice. You don't have all these little icons popping up. There's also been some tweaks to how the pit works. Pit boss damage reduced. This will be big. Before, the complaint we always had was you'd fight through the pit, you get to the end, and the bosses would just one-shot you. They've made it so the damage has been reduced, but they've added this interesting new stacking damage debuff where if you get hit by a shadow boss, you get this debuff which will make it harder for you to keep pushing because everything will do more damage to you, which I think is good. This will make it more of a skill-based system where you can't get hit by those shadow attacks. And they've also pulled the bandit sharpshooter because that one was kind of a pain. But yeah, I think this will be a good season. I'm excited. I'm excited to jump in and check out the season of the Infernal Hordes. Again, I'll be streaming live. Come stop in, say hi. I always love talking to you guys. Feel free to come ask questions or talk about build stuff. I'll have links to the Discord and the Twitch in the video description. But yeah, thanks for watching. I will catch you guys next time.